This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides. So head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more. Welcome to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven, and various different guests. And today I'm joined by Gary Newell, who is our senior horticultural buyer. Gary's been with us really quite a long time now. Welcome, Gary.
Hello. Yep, 10 years I've been with you now.
10 years, is that right?
I know, it's gone quick.
That's so good. And the reason I love talking to Gary on the podcast, as well as working with him, is he's quite a lot younger than me, but also he comes at gardening from a really different place. And he's educated me so much in the whole kind of sustainability of gardening, really. So I've always been incredibly interested in nature and biodiversity, but Gary comes from the point of water conservation, low maintenance, making things still good for the planet, good for biodiversity, but also good for the gardener and more practical. And that's actually what we're going to talk about today. So tell us a bit about your background, Gary, before you came to us.
Sure, yep. So I completed a degree in sustainable garden design at Falmouth College of Arts. From that, I went on to start a career in horticultural retail. So I did, I think, almost 6-7 years in garden centres and retail nurseries. And whilst doing that, I was consulting on design and aftercare of gardens as well. So a lot of face-to-face contact with customers, clients, and general gardeners. So sort of really picked up on what people were looking for, the struggles they had, and the help that they were looking for as well. And kind of brought that into my role at Sarah Raven and making sure we can provide people with what they're looking for.
Absolutely. And you found, as people sort of wandered down the aisle in a garden centre, they would pick up things in flower looking like, I mean, that's a sort of a bit of a cliche in a way, but of course, I mean, you know, I'm meant to know better, but I do that.
Yeah, we're all guilty of falling into that retail trap. It's something that I've picked up on a lot over my years of witnessing how people shop in garden centres, picking up plants in isolation almost, one at a time. And that shopping process for the garden, it's become almost a leisure activity without a plan in place. I've sort of witnessed how buying these plants in isolation on impulse and then seeing their performance in the garden, how it doesn't really give people what they're looking for. And it's how we can help them to avoid those traps, if you like, so that we do get the best from our gardens and that we're investing in the right way.
It's so true. And it's just all a bit bitty if you do it like that, isn't it? I mean, that's the problem.
A piecemeal approach, isn't it? So just one plant a week. Say you visit the garden centre every Sunday, you go to the coffee shop, you pick up that one plant on the way out, and then what do you do with it when you get home? And you end up with a real mismatch in the garden. And it's trying to convince people that if you invest and have a plan and do it from the very start, you're going to have a much more sustainable approach to your shopping and have a garden that ecologically works well together because you've planned it and you're thinking about how plants grow together at the very beginning and not just adding piece by piece every week.
It's so true. You know, I went to see some of my greatest friends in London over last weekend. And on Sunday morning, I went into their garden and they've just moved. And so they've got a brand new garden, blank space. She knows her stuff. She knows her plants. And she was saying, what shall I put in this sort of dark, north-facing corner, quite a big bed? And I said, oh, well, have you thought about a mix of different, you know, 1 or 2 hydrangeas or maybe 3 hydrangeas, which come and go in whether they're fashionable or not. I used to hate them. I now absolutely passionately love them because I grow them in a north-facing bed, rather similar at home. And she said, oh, yes, that's a good idea. Which one shall I get? And I said, no. This bed, you don't need 1, you need 7.
Yeah.
And that feels like a lot of money. But at least I know that if she got 5 or 7 of perhaps 1 or 2 Limelight, 1 or 2 Incredible, 1 or 2 Wims Red, or whatever. That's it, that bed done, really
And
stunning.
you know those varieties are going to work best for them. There's no risk there that they're going to fail within their first or second year. They'll take and establish perfectly. And it's the ideal foundation to start to build on for that bed. You can work around them and build up the layers of planting.
Exactly. And she just laughed and said, I was thinking 1 and you're thinking 7. I said, yeah, well, okay, maybe we compromise at 5. But it's that point, isn't it? Which is, it's much better to save and buy a block of those at some point rather than drib. Anyway, what I want to lead on to is what you have taught me about this whole way of thinking about gardening as a matrix. So I wonder, Gary, if you would just talk us all through the general principles and then we'll home in on the different layers of the matrix.
Yep. So as I said, the approach of buying in isolation has really bothered me, and I want to encourage people to have a plan when they go into garden centres or buy online, is that they're purchasing more in bulk, if you like, with a real vision of what they're working towards. But I understand it takes a lot of confidence to do that, and that's why people who can employ garden designers, but I don't feel that everybody needs a garden designer. Not everybody wants a garden designer. They want to be involved in the creation of their garden themselves and get that sense of enjoyment and achievement. So as a platform, if you like, at Sarah Raven, I feel like we can provide a structure, a strategy to a planting that is based on function and form. And that's what's led me to a take on what is referred to as matrix gardening. And for those who don't know, matrix gardening is more a landscape tool where you plan your planting in layers. And those layers are broadly over 4 layers normally, where you start off with your base layer, which is generally you can see the base layer as a ground cover layer, and that's the foundation of this plant that's going to hold it all together, and it's going to make it ecological and sustainable by knitting together various plants that want to grow together. And by doing that, you're covering the bare soil and you're keeping the moisture in the ground, and in generally creating less maintenance for yourself on that area. They're going to work for you. They're the most important part of this.
Well, and massively cutting down on the weeds.
Yeah, absolutely. The weeds, generally, there's different types of weeds. We know there's some really strong weeds out there. So it is going to require you still to work hard on the weeding within the first and second year while you're waiting for plants to establish. But we're looking at the big picture here. This is a long one. This is a landscape that we're planting. It's not going to be something that's just for the first or second year.
Yeah.
This is a long-term plan. So once the foundation layer is established, you're right, it's going to hold back all those weeds that like to move in on bare earth, basically, and give you a lot more time to sit back and enjoy it rather than having to work on it.
And so in the base layer, are they mainly tolerant of dappled shade, or have you got some real sun lovers as well?
Absolutely. It's adaptable. So you have to look at your site and assess where you think these plants are going to grow best. There's plants for shade, such as you can have some robust ferns, which will knit together and create a carpet for you. Or if you're in a more sunnier area, you can use things like sedges, like carex grasses, which work really well. And then within that, you mix in some of the more colourful blooming plants. You could have things like primulas, pulmonarias, brunneras. Just really taking note of what aspect a plant enjoys, whether it is sun or shade. I think we can both say that a plant may prefer sun, but it will survive in shade, and vice versa. If a plant says shade loving, it will survive almost as a forest edge type plants, where it gets some sunlight through the day, but also has protection. So they're very versatile plants. Don't feel restricted. If something says it's sun loving, it doesn't always mean that it can't grow in a north facing garden. It just might be a bit later to bloom or slower to establish.
And the point is that they're knitting and webbing together, covering the soil, so stopping evaporate or decreasing evaporation, decreasing weed germination because the light's not getting to the bare soil, and they're providing an ornamental, almost like an ornamental membrane, basically, aren't they, in a sense?
Yeah, a carpet almost. Yeah.
Almost like a carpet.
What I find also with this foundation layer is that a lot of the plants, they're not ground hugging, if you like. So they can still have a fair bit of height to them. A
Okay.
12-inch height is perfectly fine for this layer still. But what you find is because they're lower growing species, they tend to flower earlier in the season because they're keen to get their bloom out before they're swamped by the larger plants which come later in the year.
Yeah,
So
that's
your
interesting.
foundation layer or carpet layer, base layer, however we're going to call it, is going to be your first to bloom. It's that sort of going out of late winter into early spring. That's the plants will start to flower then mainly. And then as we go through the year, that is succeeded by the second layer, which pops through the base layer and gives you that second layer of height. And that layer, I feel like we're calling it a punctuation plant, or these boisterous blooms, as we've termed it, which are going to pop through and give you that height and really then take the eye into the next level.
Yeah.
Directing the eye through the landscape with sort of rhythm and color. So you get that contrast of height and texture and various colors. And it really brings the excitement, which the base layer has kind of finished doing its thing then, and it leads you on to the next stage within the season.
Absolutely. And these are mainly perennials. So I know you've mentioned to me heleniums. I mean, I absolutely adore Moorheim Beauty. But as you say, so you would have had the Brunner. Oh, by the way, in the base layer, would we include hellebores, particularly one of the bigger ones like Corsicus or Argutifolius?
Certainly, yeah. I think that's a really good example to say that the base layer isn't just ground hugging, ground cover types. A hellebore certainly qualifies as a base layer plant.
Yeah. I was at Kew this weekend, and the foliage of that, which of course the flowers are mainly done by this stage of the year, but the foliage was just so elegant, really. And so I was thinking it would be a good one for your base layers. Anyway, on to our boisterous blooms, so our second punctuation layer plants.
Yeah, you've mentioned heleniums, which are fantastic because they're almost part of the base layer at the early part of the season because the foliage is fairly low and they don't get going until a bit later in the year. So that foliage acts as a filler within the base layer. Then you get to late May and it starts to pop and the blooms start to produce well into late summer and autumn. So that's what you're looking for in this layer, is something that contributes to the base layer at the start of the year, and then bang, you hit the warmer months and up they come and they punctuate through that base layer.
Lovely.
I mean, other plants which work well, because you want various shapes in your blooms. So helenium is a daisy-shaped flower, so you also want spires in there as well, like lupins. Baptisia is a wonderful one as well.
Great.
Of course, salvias, some of the Nemorosa salvias like Caradonna work really well and reliable. Giving you all those various shapes of flower and form and colour just to help bring that interest to this layer. All you need. And one other tip I think is really worth remembering: a lot of time people will select all these lovely flowers, but then they all look good at the same time, and they're competing with each other. And there's a great rule that I think you can follow: is try to only have 3 plants looking their best at once throughout the year, and that will help you achieve that successional feel to your landscape. And they can lead into each other and take you right from the beginning of spring all the way into autumn.
And I remember just really practically, when I was designing the Oast Garden and various other gardens at Perch, what I do is I get baking parchment or tracing paper, but often you can't get it in big sheets. And I've got a black and white drawing on my desk, and then I overlay it with the first, let's say, Jan, Feb, March lot of tracing paper or baking parchment, and then I'll draw on the things that will be looking great at that moment. And then I'll do May, June as another sheet, and then July, August as another sheet, and then September, October as another sheet. And that really helps concentrate my mind on having a very good succession of flowers. So rather than, I mean, my mother has the most beautiful garden, but it's really at its best between the middle of May with peonies and lilacs and things until the middle of June.
I think you find that, don't you? Because you're always drawn to a certain group of plants. I certainly am. I love my woodland plants, but obviously woodland plants, they all do their thing before the trees come into leaf.
Yeah.
So a lot of the colour in my garden happens early spring, and then after that it all goes very green and quite boring at times. So I have to remind myself I need to add in other layers and bring the colour throughout the season. But we're all naturally drawn to a certain type of plant, and quite often they all flower at the same time.
Yeah. So
what you're saying about the parchment paper is great as well, because that reminds you to disperse the plants properly as well, and not just keep a certain flowering times all in one area. You need to repeat it in groups throughout the site.
Yeah, great. So that's our second layer. And then there's a third layer.
There is a third layer. The next layer that I would go to is what I would refer to as the bulb bones. It's the structure of the site.
Yeah.
Focal plants. So in a way, this is our third layer based on height, but this is the layer that I would focus on first when I was planting it.
Yes. Yeah.
Because you want to get your structure into your planting scheme first so you can see what you're working around.
Yeah.
So as structure, we can think of the eye catchers that really stop the eye in the landscape. So the vistas, they're that desire lines within the landscape that stop you and go, oh, one there, then to there, and then to there, and you lead the eye through the landscape. And they can be a repetition of the same shrub or grass or small trees, or you can mix it up. But it's just about bringing that eye up from the ground.
Yeah.
So then add on your next layer.
Yeah.
So
it's like bits of furniture in a room, isn't it? So look, you've got your carpet and now you've got the bigger, substantial bits of furniture. Yeah.
Yeah. And what they do, they bring a sense of establishment to the landscape as well. So you're wanting to buy something that is fairly established already, a good height, because we know how long shrubs take to establish. So you need something that's a decent size. Otherwise, the perennials grow so much quicker than a shrub and they will swamp it out and it will struggle to really ever get ahead of itself. So try to purchase something, I would say, for a structure of a shrub, I'm looking for something in a 15 to 20 litre pot at least.
Okay.
To get us started. If you want to start smaller, that's fine, but just be aware that you don't want your perennials to crowd it out too much. Give it plenty of space to be able to get its roots down.
Good. And examples?
I think the perfect shrubs for this sort of landscape are Catinus, Amelanchier, even the smaller trees like a Cornus cusa, maybe if you're suited to it with your soil. There's so many options out there, and it's really personal taste of what you want to achieve. Maybe you want an evergreen, maybe you want the dark purple foliage of the Catinus, or maybe you're after berries to support the wildlife. There's various factors of what you have to decide what you want from your landscape, really.
Yeah.
I think the most important thing is the structure that it brings. The other details is really down to personal choice.
Definitely. And then finally, there's a fourth layer or a fourth strand, a fourth thread.
Yeah, so this is not so much a layer, but it's something that's essential to helping the establishment of the whole matrix planting work, and this is the filler plants. So you'll find that we've mentioned about bare earth, how that is your enemy, really. You need to stop the bare earth to keep the weeds down, but obviously we know that perennial plants take time to establish. They're not that quick. They take at least 3 years, really, to get into the ground. So filler plants are things that establish very quickly, and we know that things like annuals, tender perennials, biennials, they do their thing very, very quick. They have to get into bloom as quick as possible, and they stay in bloom for a long time, and then you lose them and replace them. So these plants are going to help you fill in the bare earth while your main perennial plants are establishing. So they're really important in the first 2 to 3 years of this plan.
Yeah.
They bring you colour, but they're also doing a job for you as well. I know you particularly rely on biennials at Perch Hill for that gap, don't you, between the main June gap, really bring you the colour. But I think that it's important within the filler plants that we have a mix of biennials, annuals, and short-lived perennials.
Yeah. And so even something like pelargonium, I mean, like we've been growing a lot of tomentosum pelargonium for our more shady spots as a tender perennial in the border. So we've always had it in pots previously. But actually the foliage of that as one of these fillers is just so wonderful because it's fragrant, it's very tolerant of sun or shade, and then in full sun, you know, something like Attar of Roses, which is never that floriferous. So in a way, it's more about its scented leaf than anything. So those would work perfectly well in this filler roll, wouldn't it, in this fourth roll?
And within the filler roll, those sort of pelargoniums are going to act as a complement to the base layer because of their height.
Yes.
Obviously, they flower quite later, so it's important to think, am I going to see the flowers of the pelargoniums when my punctuation layers got going? So it's important to think about when they're going to flower and is it going to be visible within the landscape?
Yeah.
So you might want to think more like, well, I've put down salvias, tender salvias, because they grow so quick and they give us the height. So they're maybe more of the punctuation layer. There's the spreading verbenas, which quite often we think of in containers or hanging baskets, but they're fantastic landscape plants. They spread and cover, and they'll grow amongst the other plants, and they really fight for their space, so you're not going to lose them within the foliage.
In fact, there's even a series called the Endurascape series, isn't there? That was that's bred for roundabouts because they're such good temporary but really quick growers. I mean, they're not hardy, but they're just so good.
They're sort of used as amenity planting, I believe, in Australia, where it doesn't need much water, so they look after themselves. They're a great addition.
Yeah.
These are more the tender perennials that we grow as annuals in containers and things, but then we've also got the hardy annuals and half hardy annuals, which are another great addition. So things like the cosmos and your ami, helianthus, zinnias, they're another great addition to that punctuation layer, giving you the height, instant height within the first year. When you may be waiting for things like heleniums to get established and give you a good show, from these annuals that they're going to be instantly looking fantastic in the first year.
Yeah. And so if you were wanting it to make it very low maintenance, by the sort of third or fourth year, by which time your second punctuation layer and your focal plants will have grown and filled their space, and your base layer, you might want to pull back on the fourth, the more temporary filler, because you don't need it. But you may want it if you want to grow cut flowers and things. But in the first and second year, with biennials and annuals, it's absolutely critical to make the garden look substantial and well established, just as you say.
Yeah, for the enjoyment. If you will lose interest and you'll lose faith in this plan if you don't keep it looking good for yourself. So you need to make sure it's fulfilling you, and not forgetting that in that long view that by, like you say, the fourth year, this is going to be a landscape that generally takes care of itself. And other opportunities will arise as it gets older. In that fourth year period, there's going to be substantial sized perennials, which means then you can put in filler plants which might need support. So things like dahlias could start to go into the landscape.
Yeah.
Because they're supported by things like echinacea and echinops, which are growing up tall around them.
Yes.
And they don't need interference from us to support them. They've got the vegetation around them to help them grow. And then they can become great landscape plants. I think probably more the single dahlias would work better. They'll be more supporting of themselves. But it's really a blank canvas of what you want to get into that landscape will work.
Yeah. Such a good plan. So just to kind of tie it together. So basically we've got our base layer, but that doesn't go in first. So our bold bones go in first.
Yep, which is our structure.
Our structure, our shrubs. And so we draw that onto our black and white drawing. And then next goes in the base layer, which networks together into a carpet of sustainability, really. And then for real lovely floweriness, we've got boisterous blooms, which are more on the perennial side, which really give us something, as Gary says, 3 flowering at any one time. But you've always got the billowing balloons, the fourth layer, the filler plants, which will take your eye and your interest and make it look absolutely beautiful, and from which you can harvest too to bring inside, because lots of these plants that Gary's suggesting, cosmos, ami, helianthus, zinnias, are cut and come again. So the more you pick, the more they flower. So it makes really, really good design and practical sense for creating basically a really relatively low maintenance, relatively not cheap initially, but then it's not that drip, 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 walking with your trolley down the aisles in the garden centre or online or wherever.
Yeah, the feeling from my side is that economically this is far more sustainable. You're not spending money on plants which aren't going to perform for you, which a lot of people are doing week on week at the garden centre.
Yeah.
It makes much more sense to have a plan, go in and commit to, like you say, that structure layer first, get them in, and then build a plan for your base layer. Think about what you want to achieve in terms of form, texture and colour for your punctuation layer. And you can gradually build it up over time. And the satisfaction that you'll know having started Perch Hill from scratch is fantastic then, because you feel like you've done it, you've made the right decisions, and you're getting out of it what you want. And hopefully by that 3rd to 4th year, it's not taking up your whole weekend having to weed it and water it all the time. You can sit back and enjoy a landscape that you've created.
Yeah. And I suppose one final layer we might even think of adding, but maybe this is controversial with you, Gary, is through our focal plants, our bulb bones, we might want to put some climbers. So maybe we might put some clematis in there, or some honeysuckle, or, even a wisteria. Or
I think I've touched on it briefly actually in our catalogue as well, is that if you don't want shrubs, then you can use teepees with sweet peas growing up them, because they're still they're working for you in the same way. They're stopping the eye in the landscape and creating a formation, if you like, to hold it all together.
Yeah. Great. Gary, that's so interesting. I'm going to forward a link to this podcast to my friend who I was trying to persuade her to get 5 hydrangeas rather than 1, because she's starting from scratch and she hasn't got a huge amount of time to garden, although she loves to garden and she loves to be in her garden. But it really feels very sustainable in sort of all directions. And if you choose the right plants, it'll bring in the birds, the bees and the butterflies. So it's what we call a win-win situation.
Indeed.
Thanks, Gary. That was great.
Thank you.
You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.